My name is Jude Blanchette, and I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning for an important discussion of China's evolving economic policy framework. The proximate topic we'll be discussing this morning is the new dual circulation strategy, which I'm sure all of you, like me, are scratching our heads trying to figure out what the heck that means. But this was first vaguely outlined by the CCP Politburo in May. But I think really the deeper topic that we'll be exploring through our discussion today is how Beijing is diagnosing and responding to bigger geopolitical shifts that are occurring, and I think that are evident to all of us. If you read newspaper headlines here in the United States, there's a perception, I think, that Beijing is purely in a reactive state to pressure from the United States. This is the tit for tat strategy that we've seen Beijing using over the past several years. But what I hope we can explore over the next 44 minutes or so is how Beijing is, I think, really reforming its entire governance, regulatory, and administrative system to better position it for longer term challenges. One of the most important being an enduring rivalry with the United States. And even the dual circulation strategy fits into this bigger shift. And indeed, the Global Times helpfully put a point on it the other day when it said the dual circulation framework is, quote, it aims to fight US bullying and hegemony. So this is not just a pure economic policy. This is about something more important. And again, we'll dive into that today. And I can't think of two individuals better placed to help us understand dual circulation, but also these bigger shifts than my two guests today, who are also two friends. Really thrilled to welcome Wei Lingling, who is a senior China correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and the co-author of the excellent new-ish book, Superpower, Showdown, How the Battle Between Trump and Xi Threatens a New Cold War, which is right now the definitive book on not only the trade war, but how we got to this moment where we're talking about a enduring or long-term competition that some are likening to a Cold War. Lingling's book is packed with insights and anecdotes that really help us make sense of this moment we're in. And also joining us is Andrew Polk, who is the co-founder and head of economic research at Trivium China. I would suspect most people tuning in who have revealed preferences and are into things like dual circulation are already receiving Trivium's morning email tip sheet, which is one of the essential daily newsletters on China out there. And a title that is even more important to Andrew is the fact that he is also a senior associate here at the Freeman Chair. So we're going to dive right in, and I've got a volley of questions that I'm going to direct at our two guests today. But I'm going to start with Lingling and ask if she can scene set for us by just describing the basics of what is dual circulation here. You wrote a great piece a few weeks ago outlining the policy. So could you help us understand what is dual circulation and where did this come from?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to talk about this very important topic with both you and Andrew. This whole concept, dual circulation, actually is not a new concept. It was first brought up back in 1987 by a Chinese economic planning official whose name is Wang Jian. At the time, he brought up this idea of dual circulation in the sense that China should develop its export-oriented industry, trying to produce stuff, take advantage of the low labor costs, produce stuff and then sell to the outside world. And then, in exchange, China could get the money, foreign exchangers, and foreign investments to help develop the domestic economy. So as soon as that idea was brought up, the planning agency at the time mapped out a plan and was sent it up to Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping signed it off on it and said, fully agreed, do it, be daring, and don't waste time on opportunity. So that was the starting point of this whole dual circulation strategy. But at that time, the focus was very much on export-oriented industry, i.e. the foreign market and foreign investments. So over the years, especially after China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, China has become the world's factory, basically. So fast forward to today, the leadership again is talking about this concept. However, what's new nowadays is the focus on domestic circulation as opposed to the international part of the circulation concept. That means the leadership under Xi Jinping is prioritizing domestic companies, domestic markets, domestic consumption over foreign markets, foreign investments, and foreign technology. So, you know, it's not as if China were closing off its borders, not at all. The foreign investments are still important, foreign technology is still desirable, but more and more they would play a supporting role in China's economy.
And as a follow-up, Andrew, can I ask, can you help unpack a little bit more, what are the underlying issues that are that dual circulation is looking to address? And I think as just as a pretty simple question, why circulation? Why not just emphasis? Where did this word come from, and what does that mean?
Yeah, great question. So I think really the emphasis on dual circulation, in my view, has become an issue now based on, kind of as you said at the outset, really a recognition of something that's changed externally, of the new environment that China's economy is operating in globally. And so if you read a lot of commentary out there right now on dual circulation, people are saying often, oh, we've heard all this before. This is old wine in new bottles. This was rebalancing under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. And this is just a new name for the same old thing. And I would disagree with that in a way. One, I would agree with it in a way to say the policy goals that China is trying to pursue, having a resilient economy, moving up the value chain, increasing the overall wealth of the people in the country, haven't changed. What has changed is the external context. And so fundamentally, while this is an emphasis on the domestic economy, for me, it's less about sort of the shift toward domestic demand and more about increasing the resiliency and self-sufficiency of the domestic economy against the vagaries of the external economy, the global economy. And that kind of takes on several facets. One is, the issue on semiconductors, the vulnerability of Chinese tech companies to external inputs in a world with increased geopolitical tensions. The second is even just things like, China is now recovering, and one of the things holding back its recovery is the fact that the rest of the global economy has not recovered, and so its export sector is struggling. And so it more generally wants to kind of not necessarily link the domestic cycle with the global cycle, which is where I think the circulations come into play. And so I just really want to emphasize that this, in a way, the policy goals still really are the same, but it's the reaction, and this policy, in my view, is a reaction to an external variable that has changed and has changed the emphasis in some of the policy goals or sort of some of the policy strategies and tactics. What those ultimate emphases will be, we don't really know, because we are at the stage, I'm sure all your listeners will know how Chinese policy generally works. this broad strategic framework is put forward with some basic goals and principles, and then for months, the experts, the policy experts and advisors debate the best specific details to achieve those principles and goals. And that's where we are now, and that's why we're having this conversation, to try to stay up front and keep our finger on the pulse of what those ultimate policy goals will be to achieve, or excuse me, policy details will be to achieve the principles of self-sufficiency and domestic economic resiliency.
Yeah, and Andrew, I want to come back to asking about this, about the policymaking process in a minute, because I think one of the rush to judgment that we've seen so far is, and we've seen this again and again and again, where a vague concept will be announced by the Politburo, the senior leadership, and the commentariat rush in to poo-poo it as vacuous, meaningless. But I think, as you're articulating here, that's really the first inning, and that you have an entire process which then unveils itself about how they sketch in the details. But Lingling, if I can go back to you for a minute, because you've been following this with your reporting hat on. How did this come to become announced in May? And I wanted to ask you specifically about, what do we know about whose brainchild this was, this new iteration of dual circulation, and any insight into how this got up on Xi Jinping's desk for him to push this out at a Politburo meeting?
Sure. It's the brainchild of Liu He, Xi Jinping's point person on economic policy. As we all know, Liu He also is the chief trade negotiator with the U.S. So he definitely, has a front row seat in terms of, how this external environment, what Angie just referred to, has changed for China. This escalation of tensions between U.S. and China, the 2 years of trade war already, made the Chinese leadership realize the U.S. is no longer a reliable partner. So they really will have to step up in terms of reducing their reliance on foreign supply, especially high-tech sector, semiconductors being the core of it. Another point I just wanted to add is, this is also, this whole esoteric sounding concept is also Liu He's way of forcing some sort of structural reforms in China by using a concept that can be accepted by his boss. As we all know that, Liu He definitely has a pro-market reputation, both in China and in the United States. He definitely realizes all those structural issues in the economy that is holding back its potential. For example, the misallocation of credit, the long-standing issue of financial repression. I don't think he's a big fan of industrial subsidies as well. He also sees the need to really inject more market discipline into SOEs. And all those things, Chinese leadership have talked for many, many years. And some of the issues were also the very things the US negotiators brought up, during the beginning of the trade war. But it never has gone far enough to getting addressed. So this is another attempt being made by Liu He to sort of get additional momentum, new momentum to get the reform going, because the very concept of relying on domestic circulation or domestic economy, domestic consumers, domestic markets would require China to really carry out some of the reforms, boost incomes for individuals, right? Open more markets for private businesses, so they would feel more incentivized to expand and spend, empowering the Chinese consumers. So if China can really do all those things, and they might really be successful with, reshifting the economy toward more of a domestic focus. However, the jury is still out. You talked about how they end up on Xi Jinping's desk. Earlier this year, I remember it was January, right after I came back from Washington in Beijing, I was talking to some of my sources about, what the government had in plan for 2020 in terms of economic targets and all that. Back then, I remember Premier Li Keqiang just did a meeting with some of the private sector economists, and they were talking about, we think this year should be fine. We can easily reach the 6% growth target. So it was a very, rosy outlook beginning of the year. Then the pandemic hit, right? So it was all about trying to save companies from declaring bankruptcy. And a lot of people in terms of domestically and foreign investors as well were kind of expecting China to announce a huge stimulus package, right? Doing what they did back in 2008. And then instead of launching a stimulus package, I think it was sometime in late April or early May as well, China announced a plan which was, overlooked by a lot of people. The plan called for deeper reforms in so-called deeper reform of market resources, like how do you price commodities, how do you and land reform and some long-standing hukou reform issues. So that was the early sign that this kind of agenda, a new policy agenda was in the works. That was one of the early signs. So instead of going back to the old way of spurring growth by heavy-handed government intervention, stimulus, the leadership is now just let's try something else. Let's do this policy, this new policy shift and try to refocus it on the domestic economy. But of course, as Andrew pointed out earlier, still so vague. Nobody knows what really is going to go into this agenda. So the jury is still out exactly, what they're going to do to refocus the economy.
Jude, can I layer on the back of those comments just real quick before we move on, just to make a couple of quick points that I think Lingling made, but I really want to emphasize because I think they're very important. One is this idea that Liu He is trying to push through some ideas that have been priorities for a long time, and everyone says, they've talked about market reform or they've talked about shift to domestic demand. One of the realities of the dual circulation is a recognition that because the external environment has fundamentally changed for the negative, some long-standing priorities have to be sped up, and they have to be sped up now. So thinking in particular, self-sufficiency, technological self-sufficiency. So saying, they've been talking about this for years, misses the point that minds in Beijing are concentrated. We have to do this now. It's a moment that has changed. And the second thing that Lingling made that I just really like to emphasize is we are in the middle, in my view, we're in the middle of a fundamental shift in terms of macroeconomic and development thinking in Beijing. And we have to recognize that like old school stimulus, that's not happening. And there's a new effort to manage the economy in a different way that recognizes the new external reality. And that's why I think dual circulation is so important, and it's so, it's really dangerous is the wrong word, but dangerous to dismiss it as nothing, because that misses the point that we're in an inflection point in economic thinking in Beijing, in my view.
So I wanted to drill down actually a couple points that Lingling made, and so maybe Andrew, I can first start with you on these, which is I think one could interpret the domestic circulation as a doubling down on industrial policy made in China 2025. Lingling just laid out a vision, though, of, I think, a different trajectory or approach. It doesn't exclude the idea of industrial policy, but it I think has a much more optimistic view of what a concerted effort to boost domestic consumption could necessitate in terms of reforms. I wanted to just see if you could ruminate on this as well. What are the trajectories here that we might see Beijing pursue in terms of concerted economic policy as it looks to drive this domestic circulation? I think the point being, at this early stage, it will be important for us as we observe this not to lock ourselves in to a narrative that this is only industrial policy or this just means a doubling down on Made in China 2025. So I just want to sort of open up the aperture on what this might entail.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's important to make the point that as the policy debate heats up, we may see some really interesting and kind of unexpected developments. So we've been covering this former PBOC advisor, Sheng Song Chung, who's arguing that part of dual circulation should be further opening the capital account, which would actually, he argues, help make the domestic economy more resilient because it would incentivize foreign multinationals to invest more long-term capital into China because they would be able to move profits out and manage cross-border capital more easily. So that's an sort of counterintuitive argument that's being made. More generally, I think in Chinese leaders' minds, the industrial policy move and supporting SOEs is not necessarily in contradiction to boosting domestic demand and helping people consume more. So that's something we have to recognize. In our view, from Western eyes, I think we often see, like, how can these two things be complementary or even coexist? But at least in the Chinese policymakers' minds, they seem to be able to actually counterbalance each other and coexist together. I would say on the consumer side, my view is that so far the policy discussion has been very lacking. There's actually been almost nothing in the policy discussion that's been like, how are we going to increase consumption in the domestic economy, right? There's no talk about, social safety net, getting the savings rate down, any of that stuff. In fact, Li Keqiang was talking to Chang'an Auto in Chongqing saying, you need to help boost domestic demand by making better products. Well, that's not how it works. So I think on the domestic demand side, it's still an open question as to where the consumer fits in, how that'll work. We're definitely seeing a lot on the industrial policy side. And as we talked about before, Yu Yongding, former PBOC central bank advisor, said basically, this only makes Made in China 2025 more important. Like, it changes the context, so we have to, in a way, double down on that. What's changed, in my view, is, and again, this is from Yu Yongding's point, which I think is starting to get some currency in the policy thinking, is that what China doesn't want to do too much is focus on services and again, that consumer piece. They view the US and UK economies as having sort of developed to the point where they overshot in terms of moving up the value chain. The highest value add, economic activity is in that services piece. But in the Chinese view, moving too far to services, focusing too much on services, hollows out the manufacturing piece. They would rather emulate a German model where you ensconce yourself at the very highest end of the manufacturing value chain and are able to then, you don't overshoot into services, but you're still at the top of that value chain on the manufacturing side, because they think that really leads to sustainable economic resiliency when you're producing high value add goods for both domestic and external consumption and are highly competitive on the global market. And I just think that's a really interesting idea, because I think given our current policy discussion in the US in terms of reliance on China, I think that idea would probably have some currency in the US right now as well, in terms of, there's been a lot of decrying that our manufacturing sector has been too hollowed out, and now we can't produce the pharmaceuticals that we need or whatever else. And so that, I think, is going to be a big piece of this in terms of the industrial policy side trying to ensconce themselves at the upper end of the manufacturing value chain. And I think if they are, who knows if they can achieve it, but even if they're just partially successful in doing that, that will disrupt a whole, a bevy of industries if they become competitive at the higher end of the manufacturing value chain.
Yeah, Andrew, you've actually preempted two questions I was going to bring to you later. So I want to just put a pin because I do want to come back to this idea of a German model, which technically came out in a piece that you and I put out together on Monday, but was really your point. So I want to unpack that a little bit more, and what would Beijing need to do in terms of policy adjustments to be able to position China in that way. And I also want to talk about the partial success idea of evaluating policy. As we've talked about a lot, oftentimes there's dismissal of Beijing policy efforts saying it will, quote, fail. And one of the things I think we've long talked about is it's not a binary 100% success or 100% failure. If China's 30% successful on tackling some of these issues, the knock-on effects are pretty significant. Lingling, I wanted to go back to you. I wanted to ask you if you could unpack this idea of self-sufficiency, by which I mean, again, I think when we hear the term or when we see the zili gengsheng, written in Chinese, I think we immediately think this is kind of autarky, or this is China, and I think it's often dismissed when we see, or as Andrew said, we see a tension between internationalization and integration with the global economy and an emphasis on self-sufficiency. I think we think that's a contradiction in terms. When Chinese leadership is talking about deepening or making more progress on self-sufficiency in some of these key areas, including, I think, key technologies, what do they mean by that? Do they mean we're really going to be fully isolated and we're going to do this all domestically with no external interlinkages, or do they have something else in mind?
I agree with what you just said earlier about the confusion. Unfortunately, there are many contradictions in China's policymaking and their different policy agendas. For the Chinese leadership, right now it's like their Sputnik moment in the sense that the trade war and the recent downward spiral of the bilateral relationship between the US and China, if they were ever looking for a moment to get their act together and rally the troops, now is the moment. Because it's actually nothing new. China has been talking about reducing reliance on foreign technology for many years. It actually goes back to even Hu Jintao, right? The era of Hu Jintao. Obviously it was accelerated because the Made in China 2025 plan. And nowadays, the effort is even more sweeping. We have written about this Anke project, right? Translated as 安全可靠, secure and controllable in China. And we're seeing a new version of Made in China 2025 being put together. As Andrew said, industrial policy is here to stay in China. I totally agree with that. However, I do believe the leadership, especially the economic team under Liu He, they have seen the weaknesses and the inefficiencies in the previous plans. Especially Made in China 2025, it has resulted in a lot of wasteful products, and China, despite all those money spent on semiconductor, still lagging behind US, Japan, Germany. So nowadays they're trying to tweak how they approach this. They're getting companies to more and more involved in designing the plan and carrying out the plan. For instance, the Anke project I was just talking about, the whole idea is to build a technological ecosystem in China, right? Where domestic vendors can produce everything from hardware to supplying services. So by the end of last year, as far as I can remember, more than 180 companies signed up for that plan. So they're both state-owned and private businesses. They're getting more involved in terms of advising the government, how to really, how to, what kind of policies, would be desirable for them, and how to implement the plan going forward. So they're definitely making tweaks to industrial policy, trying to make it more efficient. Maybe that's the German model both of you were talking about. So definitely China, the leadership, the trade war has made them realize China has relied too much on American technology, and that has to end. And they are taking actions to address that. Whether or not they can be successful, I mean, it's not guaranteed. What is working in Beijing's favor is the fact that China is such a dynamic and innovative country of 1.4 billion people. The smartness of the Chinese people is without doubt. But there's something to be said about democratic system, right? It's good for innovation, good for competition. And a state-led model, we have seen years, how the kind of weaknesses in this inherent in this kind of model. So whether or not they can pull it off, let's wait and see. And I just want to quickly address a couple other points, potential components of this domestic dual circulation model. We talked about technology side, right? This more emphasis on self-sufficiency. Another component is the consumption. However, as Andrew pointed out earlier, there haven't been any concrete policy steps aimed at, reducing financial repression or increase empowering consumers. My guess, an educated guess, is that the policy focus will be more on the tax side. We're already seeing this giant plan to develop Hainan, right? Make it a duty-free zone. So that's a component. That's a way of trying to boost consumption. But then the question is, does that mean Hainan only? Like we can only go to Hainan and buy duty-free goods? And can I take those products out of Hainan? Can I use it in Beijing or Shanghai or Guangzhou? So that's a question to be worked out. Another component of this dual circulation concept, it would be on the financial side. You're already seeing Chinese regulators stepping up efforts to build up the A-share markets, build up their answer to NASDAQ, the new star board, because again, the external environment has changed. China Inc. is now facing this, a threat of getting delisted from the US. So where to go? Let's go back to China. So another component would be defense. It's a very big part of domestic circulation. Defense industry has long, it's always the top priority for the Chinese government. But reforming that area has been very lagging. So we have already seen that in recent months, Xi Jinping has installed some of his key allies with defense industry background into some key economic posts, like the new deputy of NDRC. So we potentially are going to see them, making sure that China also build up its domestic capabilities when it comes to key defense-related equipment and manufacturing capabilities.
Thanks. Those are excellent thoughts. I've just scribbled a bunch more questions that I hope we can get through in the next 10 minutes. And I was struck, Lingling, when you were talking about Beijing's diagnosis that it's overly exposed to international supply chains where the US can exert pressure. It's interesting that both Beijing and DC have come to the same diagnosis about their exposure to the other country. And of course, that's one of the structural features I think that's driving bifurcation or decoupling is both countries, and I think increasingly other capitals around the world, look at their international exposure, especially on critical supply chains, and they all come to the same diagnosis. And so thinking about this as a more enduring trend, I think, is important because these aren't short-term considerations. There's a lot I want to get through in the next sort of 10 or so minutes. Andrew, I wanted to come back to you and ask about, you had initially talked about the interlinkages, or I guess the connections between dual circulation as an add-on, or as the sort of as the follow-on to supply-side structural reform. The reason I wanted to ask you about supply-side structural reform is to help us think through how we should understand how policies unfold. There was some dismissal of supply-side structural reform. Bizarrely, people were saying it was like Ronald Reagan's supply-side reform. I think they hadn't read anything about it before they started making those comparisons, but poo-pooing it or dismissing it in the early stages. How does looking at how supply-side structural reform, how it unfolded, how does that help us understand dual circulation and how we should be understanding tempo, pace, and the policy-making process?
Yeah, so well, a couple of things. One is, I think some of the hallmarks of supply-side structural reform are, seen in dual circulation. Number one is that it comes from Liu He, who is, the man when it comes to economic policymaking in China. He's Xi Jinping's right-hand man on the economy. Seems like he largely pushes things forward, and if Xi gives the thumbs up, then, Xi seems to even kind of take a hands-off approach and let Liu He go for it. So just that simple fact is important. Secondly, supply-side structural reform was a response to a change in the economic environment and extreme economic uncertainty. So back in 2015, when supply-side structural reform was first articulated at the end of that year, it had been 5 years worth of deflationary pressure in China. The economy was growing extremely slowly. There was a domestic slowdown on top of the sort of medium-term deflationary pressure. Then, there was the stock market bubble burst. There was, they adjusted the fixing mechanism for the currency on how they do the exchange rate. That led to massive capital outflows. And, they stepped back and said, this thing might go off the rails. We have to change tack. And that's when they came up with supply-side structural reform. And consequently, or interestingly, that was 2 years before a party Congress. Supply-side structural reform then got in the party constitution. We're similarly 2 years out from a party Congress. Will dual circulation end up in the party constitution? So that's the second thing. The third thing is, in the domestic policy debate, dual circulation is explicitly being tied to supply-side structural reform as an extension of that policy. And in a way, it's like they're now looking at supply-side structural reform was fundamentally like a recognition that China was producing the wrong goods based on the demand that the economy had. So they were like, we need to try to adjust literally the supply of the economy. And now they're circling back to the demand side again. They're saying, well, we need to also keep supply changes in balance with demand changes. And so that to me is kind of fundamentally how they are linked. But to your point about sort of how supply-side structural reform unfolded, it was rolled out at the, I think, December Economic Work Conference in 2015. Yeah. For 3 or 4 months, it was all anyone was talking about in the Chinese policy debate. In the Western policy, commentariat, it was, oh, this is Reagan-esque, it doesn't mean anything, it's another slogan, again, old wine, new bottles. But through a process of several months, first they articulated 5 buckets, clear buckets under supply-side structural reform. So upstream capacity consolidation, financial de-risking. I'm going to miss a few if you guys can help me. Fixing the short boards or the limitations in the economy. I'm blanking.
You failed the test, Andrew.
I know. If it was 2016, I couldn't have done it like that. And 2 others, I can't remember. But and then they basically just went down that list over the course of the next several years. So they started with capacity cuts. That had a huge impact on domestic commodity demand.
And just to find, Andrew, capacity cuts, you mean sort of overcapacity, gluts in commodities like steel, cement.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And there's debate around how long-term or successful that was, but there's no debate that it immediately impacted the functioning of the economy and the economic cycle and global commodities prices. So we could, once they get a little bit more clarity on dual circulation, we could see a similar impact. And then, in 2017, they kicked off the second bucket, which is financial de-risking, and that's been a huge part of the policy agenda since that time. And then they kind of went on down on the others that apparently I've forgotten. But so I would say we're now in that period where they're talking about, okay, we got the key principles. Now let's define sort of the sort of next level down, the elements of this that we're really going to push forward. And then I'd expect over the next 5 years, we see, under the key elements of the policy, specific actions rolled out to make it a reality. Will it ultimately be successful? Well, we don't know, because we don't know exactly what the ultimate policy goals will be. But back to your point, supply side structural reform didn't get rid of, coal and steel overcapacity, but it certainly, made a move at the margin, which then affected global markets.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing?
Sure, please,
to what
please.
Andrew said about supply side reform. I do think it really helped stabilize China's economy between 2016 and 2007, even throughout 2018. I remember a conversation I had with a Chinese official in the midst of the trade war. And he said something like, thank God for supply side reform. Otherwise, China's economy would have been in a shittier state. We would have no leverage whatsoever throughout the negotiation process. But as we know, right, back when the trade war started in 2018, China's economy, had recovered quite nicely, right? But however, the consequences of the supply side reform, may be unintended, was that it further discouraged private businesses, because a lot of overcapacity that was cut was production by private coal miners, right? Steel makers, etc.
Cognizant of time here, I want to sneak in a few last questions. First is, and I want to put this to both of you, but maybe Andrew, I'll start with you and then go to Lingling to give Lingling a chance to catch her breath. We've been talking about the domestic circulation a lot in this discussion, and we've left out what the international circulation looks like. And so I wanted to ask you, envision what in Beijing's mind is the international circulation component of this look like? And there's a lot of implications of that. I mean, I was on a call with one of the most knowledgeable China watchers last night, who said, what does this mean for BRI? So can you help us think through what the international circulation looks like, or at least what the motivating vision is for Beijing here? And then the last question, and Lingling, I'll just tee this up, is we've got the new 5-year plan coming out, or we'll begin. We're already seeing some concrete glimpses of what's in it. But what I wanted to ask you is a two-parter. First part is, what do we know about what's going to be in this? And I also wanted to know if you could help us think through, how do we as external observers understand how all these plans fit together? I mean, we could put up on a blackboard 5,000 different plans that exist here, from 5-year plans, and then provincial 5-year plans, and we have industrial plans, we have local level plans, we have SOE plans. Can you help us just think through how all these fit together as an ecosystem? But first, Andrew, I'll go to you with, what is the international circulation here, and think through what are some implications for those of us watching the webinar today.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll try to do this quickly. I mean, it's not a step wholesale away from the global economy or integration with the global economy. And in fact, I would argue it may deepen China's integration with the global economy. What the goal is to sort of look at China's linkages with the global economy and understand where those linkages create vulnerabilities. And in those cases, potentially cut the linkages, like in the semiconductor space, where the linkages create, advantages and benefits for China, deepen those linkages, right? And so, again, this is the point about potentially opening the capital account. Could that incentivize foreign companies to invest deeper long-term into China if they could move money across the border more easily? Certainly, all the discussion around this is sees a role for foreign companies in China as part of the dual circulation strategy, but it's limit the vulnerabilities and where the international circulation is helpful, deepen that, and that will certainly mean more financial linkages. Interestingly, they're also like some of the specific articulations of potential policy is to reduce the balance of payment surpluses that China has. So both trade surpluses and financial surpluses, because a more developed economy shouldn't have such large dual surpluses. So in a way, they agree, with the U.S. administration. They want to lower the surplus with the U.S. and some other key countries, because they see that as even though in the short term it seems like, oh, people are buying a lot of our goods, it still leaves them vulnerable to things like trade tensions. And so that's how I think they want to adjust. Now, what the ultimate outcomes of those are going to be, I think, I can't unpack that in 30 seconds, but I would just, emphasize there will be some deepening of those ties and then severing of other ties.
Great, Lingling. Final two questions to you. Same question about any thoughts on what the international circulation will look like or implications. And then the final one is just any thoughts on the upcoming 5-year plan, which we should see some more concerted hints at the 5th plenum.
Sure. Also, just very briefly, I would only say that in terms of international circulation, how big the international circle will be for China will largely depend how big China's friend circles is going to be. So will U.S. and Japan and developed world be part of it, or it's just going to be, its friends in Africa and other parts of Asia? So that the geopolitical issues will play a big part in this. In terms of the upcoming, the 14th 5-year plan that's being drafted, again, being led by Liu He. They started the whole process, I think, sometime last year. One thing to be on the lookout for is whether or not the plan will, again, include all those numerical targets, growth targets, for employment, for annual growth rates, etc., or they will really do what they have been saying all along, downplaying the kind of quantitative measures as opposed to quantitative measures, and at the same time, emphasizing more on qualitative measures. So that's one thing to be on the lookout for. And as we know that the Central Committee of the Communist Party will have plenum in October. Among many issues also include personnel issues. This whole dual circulation, this whole economic agenda will also be discussed there, and more details will be fleshed out, in terms of exactly what kind of policies that would involve. And I believe that the whole dual circulation will be written into the next 4-year plan. So you talked about earlier, how all those documents out there, how do we decide which ones to read through and which ones to just toss, right? I think once the 14th 5-year plan gets released, probably next spring, that's the top level blueprint, right? It sets like the chief goals they want to achieve, and then gradually different ministries, different economic agencies will follow up with detailed policies and implementation guidelines.
Great, thank you. That was super helpful, Lingling. And I want to apologize. We've gone 4 minutes over time, but such is the quality of the discussion and the insights here. I think one of the topics that we didn't get a chance to discuss, but maybe this could be a follow-on conversation, is just unpacking further what I think is implicit in all of the comments today, which is Beijing's view that bifurcation, decoupling, whatever we want to call it, geopolitical rivalry is an enduring trend. And instead of being entirely reactive to this, that Beijing is really, I think, leaning into this and attempting to formulate policy which better positions it out five or 10 years. And the implications of this, I think, are incredibly important, because we are looking at something I think we've all been talking about for a few years, which is clearly we've undergone a paradigm shift in terms of globalization. And Andrew and I were talking before the call. Wei just gave a speech, and they posted the text this morning. And the headline of this speech is "Laissez-faire globalization is insufficient. It's done." And he said, we need to have a new model of globalization which balances equity and security. And I thought that latter word, security, is the crucial word here. That, to me, is the driving impetus behind why so many governments, from Canberra to Berlin to Beijing to Washington, D.C., are reformulating how integrated they want to be in the global economy. I think they see fundamental national security vulnerabilities, especially on the technology side. But increasingly, human capital, across the board, they're looking at movement of goods, people, capital, technology as having security vulnerabilities and exposures that they find unacceptable. And so it's that deep underlying driver which is compelling this rethink here. It just seems to me Beijing is better at it than the US is right now. But Lingling, I take your point entirely, and that's the complicated issue here is how successful is China going to be at this? I think you made a crucial point, which is worthy of an entire session or report, which is the constraints that China Inc. is increasingly facing here, and how Beijing is going to respond to that. Your great point at the end of how big the circle of friends is, how large the market is, as governments are raising investment screening barriers to China, as they're looking to crack down on China Inc.'s ability to be investing and making acquisitions. The EU is doing this, certainly the US is. You can bring all your Chinese companies home, but that's going to shrink the pie and the opportunity set that Beijing has. So this, to me, is the really complicated, crucial area that we need to look into. But anyway, that was a overly long comment to your really great insights. I really appreciate it. Appreciate everyone who joined today. Sign up for the tip sheet, buy Lingling's book, pay the $10,000 to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. And want to thank both you and Andrew. Really great discussion. Great to see you, and hope we can have future discussions on this important topic.
Thanks, Jude.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks everyone.
Bye.